Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into the Palestinians, colonizers, or colonized. Let's get started. Most of our time here at the Jewish Diaspora Report podcast is spent talking about Israel, Jewish issues around the world, and we talk vaguely about the Palestinian Arabs because they do coincide in many cases with Israel, whether it's terrorism, peace deals, history, all of these things that we talk about usually from a Jewish lens. On this episode, I wanted to try something a little bit different, and we're going to talk a little bit from their lens. Needless to say, I'm sure most of you know the general broad strokes of the Palestinian Arabs, how they got here, and what their history is. The problem with this, though, is that despite history being pretty much black and white, it either happened or didn't, there's a lot of misinformation depending on which side you talk to. We have people claiming that the Palestinian Arabs of today have no connection to the land. We also have people who are Palestinian Arabs saying that the Israelis have no connection to the land, and the Palestinians are actually the Jews from the Bible. So how do we know which one is true? How do we get to the bottom of this big mystery? Surely you know that you could find data to support either or both sides, whether it's the DNA of the Jews that we've talked about on this podcast before that dates back to the land, that proves we were there. But then you have studies, sometimes, that claim that Palestinian Arabs belong in the land and that they are also Levantine. So how do we make sense of all of this? We have two countering points. Can they both be true? And the very simple answer to this is sort of. It is kind of messy, depending on which stats you're looking at. And we're going to get into all of that on this podcast. We want to talk about where the Palestinian Arabs came from and what their legitimate or illegitimate claim is to the land. In order to discuss this, we need to look at the broader picture at the time when the Arabs entered the land. And this is a key point that is often used and refused depending on which side you talk to. From the Jewish perspective, we all know the Arab conquest did in fact happen. The Arab world, and sadly the Western world, likes to pretend that the Arab colonization of the Middle East and North Africa didn't happen. When you ask them, well, how did everyone turn Muslim if they weren't Muslim before? And they don't really have an answer for that. In a little quiz that one influencer, Tal the Traveling Clat, uses, is he likes to ask a lot of trolls if they can explain the following question. Firstly, if you look at North America, the religion of North America is, for the most part, Christian minus some immigration, and they speak English. So therefore, that is a product of colonization. The English and the Christians went over to that land and converted everybody, or killed them, and made it a English Christian colony. If you look at South America, they all speak Spanish. They are all Christian. They definitely weren't speaking Spanish and Christian before the Spanish arrived. That is a product of colonization. But somehow when we look at the Arab world, for some reason, the Arab world that all speaks Arabic and almost entirely is made up of Islamic faith, that is not colonization? How does that work? For some reason, people don't like to accept this narrative, for whatever reason you can decide. Why we pretend this colonization, just like every other colonization, isn't the same. But it is. The Arabs took over a whole bunch of regions during the Arab conquest and converted people to their religion, and they essentially Arabized them. If we think about, let's say, Iraq, they had the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Arameans, the Kurds, all of these people who lived with their own beliefs, their own languages, their own culture. And all of them today are gone. They're all Arabs, apparently. Similarly, if you look at Northern Africa, places like Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, you had Berbers or Amazigh people, and they had their own language and their own culture. But today, all of them are apparently just Arabs who believe in Islam. It really is no different than the North American tribes that were all kind of forced out or converted to Christianity. But for some reason, they have a special status when it comes to the Arabs. It didn't happen. Everybody was just always Arabs somehow. And what's even more interesting is how this Arab conquest that pretty much everybody can see and everybody knew somehow didn't affect the land of Israel or Judea. Of course it did. The Arabs came in just the same as they went into every other indigenous people. And what was the first thing they did? They tried to conquer it. When you try to conquer a people, first thing, of course, is militarily. And then secondly, is you want to push your views onto them, turn the people into Arabs and Islamic. But you have a couple ways you can do that, either by the sword, which did in fact happen, or by trying to softly convince the local people to give up their beliefs. And amazingly, it worked pretty well in most of the Middle East, everywhere pretty much except for Israel. Typically speaking, the colonization or Arabization of all of these people was a little bit slow at first. People were a little bit more hesitant to give up their beliefs, their faith, and take on this random thing from across the world. For example, in the years after the Arab conquest, the Muslims were actually a minority in their conquered lands. In Egypt, for example, Muslims may have only made up about 10% of the people. But over time, we saw a huge growth in the Muslim population. For example, by the year 1000 in Iraq and Syria, it was up to 50 to 70%. Then by the 1300s, 90%. In places like North Africa, about 30 to 50% in the year 1000, and then 70 to 90% by 1300. There's no question that there's this gradual takeover of Muslims, either by immigration or conversion, into these areas. And it's not a surprise considering we know from the documentation given by the Muslims how they treated their people. The Quran specifically says that those people of the book, being Jews and Christians mostly and a few other recognized religions, were allowed to pay the jizya, a humiliation tax, something that would be so burdensome to many that they only had a choice to convert or die. But I guess that's probably better than the other option, which are people who are not recognized religions. They had a choice to convert or die. They didn't even have a chance for a jizya. The jizya, being also known as a protection tax, means that if you weren't paying it, you had no protection in an Arab land. And therefore, it was open season to take your things and possibly kill you. Or, if you're lucky, you might get to flee to another country. So it is absolutely not a surprise that people who had to pay the jizya would possibly consider converting. It was literally the intention. If you don't want this burdensome tax, you can just convert to Islam. No problem. And then you pay a lot less. And we saw this happen, as you can tell from the statistics, all over North Africa and in the Middle East. It didn't happen as much in Israel. But in some minority cases, it did actually happen. And you do have some Jewish people who converted either to Christianity first and then Islam, or directly to Islam, in order to avoid having to pay the jizya. And this tiny minority of people who converted today call themselves Palestinians. Ironically, many of them don't even realize that they are actually part of the Jewish community. They were forced converted from Judaism. Or they know, but they refuse to tell anybody due to the shame. This is a very important point because oftentimes you'll hear from them that we are indigenous to the land. And a very few of them actually are. Not because they are Palestinian, but because they're actually Jewish, the real indigenous people to the land. And many times you will hear this same argument being used by DNA testing people. I tested my DNA and it says that I'm from this land, so that means that all Palestinians are from this land. However, this is not true. Many studies that are done with DNA that try and suggest that Palestinians come from that land is mainly just using these type of Palestinians, actually Jewish people, and trying to claim that everyone's the same. Unfortunately for many Palestinian Arabs today, their DNA pretty much outs them, which is why there's currently a change.org petition against DNA companies demanding that all of these Palestinians who are getting results that say Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, want their DNA results to say Palestinian, which isn't a thing. You have to remember, Palestine actually never existed other than under the British. So what we are seeing here, oftentimes, is the cherry picking of data where they find a couple of converted Jewish people, who were force converted by the way, and taking their DNA to suggest that they are indigenous, despite the fact that we have Ottoman and British records which proves how many people immigrated to the land. So some Palestinian Arabs, a minority, actually are indigenous to the land because they're Jewish. And many, the vast majority, are not indigenous because they immigrated and they know it. And the only reason why this claim even holds a little bit of water is because the world pretends that the Arabs didn't colonize and force convert people. We know they did. They did it everywhere around the Middle East and North Africa. So of course they would do the same thing in Israel. But this reality doesn't negate the other documentation we have about the fact that the vast majority are not indigenous. We can have it both ways. Some are because they were Jews, and many aren't. Just because some were indigenous and were colonized doesn't make the colonizers more indigenous. Unfortunately for these people, they have had a very difficult time trying to piece together their history. Whereas some Palestinian Arabs might actually be Jews and not willing to say anything or don't even realize it, many other ones are immigrants trying to pretend to be indigenous people. One of the biggest issues that faces the Palestinian Arab narrative is the fact that they have claimed for a very long time to be indigenous and accept that maybe the Arabs force converted them, but it definitely wasn't from the Jews because the Jews never were in the land, so they needed to find a people that were in the land that they are somehow related to, but not the Jews. And the only thing that they could cling to at that time was claiming that their name, Palestinians, which by the way is not Arabic, actually shows they are from the Philistines. This theory went for a very long time, suggesting we are the descendants of the Philistines. The Arabs came in and conquered us and turned us into Arabs and Muslims, and that's why we were indigenous. The problem with this theory is that the Philistines disappeared many years before. It is absolutely well documented that the Philistines were destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. The same person that came and destroyed Jerusalem wiped out the Philistines. We also know that in subsequent post-exile Jewish states, there was no mention whatsoever of the Philistines. The Philistines were essentially gone. So you'll have to explain how a group that disappeared in 600 BCE, that was never documented in the area since then, somehow were you guys and then you were force converted by the Arabs? That's a little bit of a stretch. Where were you? Why did no other group talk about you? And another ironic situation about the whole Philistine idea is the fact that the Philistines themselves have the name Pelishtim, which means in Hebrew, invader, because the Philistines themselves were invaders. They were Greek. So if you talk to a Palestinian Arab today, not that many use this claim anymore because it's so widely debunked, are you an Arab coming from Arabia, or are you a Greek person coming from the Philistines who were from Crete? You kind of can't have it both ways. You're one or the other. You're either an Arab or you're Greek. And whichever one you choose, you're a colonizer. So this is why this talking point kind of left the fray a long time ago. People gave up on this claim because it was so embarrassing to call yourself an invader and admit you're from the Greek islands while calling yourself an Arab. It really wasn't working out for them. So they kind of gave up on that talking point and hoped nobody would recognize the fact that they call themselves Palestinians because they apparently were related to the Philistines, despite the fact that now they admit that they have no relation to the Philistines. While, by the way, also not admitting that the reason they took their name was because of the Romans who named the land Syria Palestina, which they co-opted and used. I know, your head is probably spinning right now trying to make sense of this all. Trust me, it's not easier for them either. So this Philistine idea really didn't work out for them. They kind of gave it up. But they were thinking we still need to find a way to claim we were here before the Jewish people and were indigenous. So therefore, a somewhat more modern claim came up where they're no longer the Philistines, but they're in fact the Canaanites, because they've had a lot of time to look through the Torah and find out who was there supposedly before the Jews, and their Canaanites were there. So now they claim we were here first because we Palestinian Arabs are actually Canaanites. It would be kind of a solution to their problem if they were Canaanites, because the reality is we do know that the Canaanites technically were there, supposedly, before the Jews, so therefore it would make it their land. The problem with that is that the Jews are in fact the Canaanites, not the Palestinians. We could get to DNA in a second, because there is some proof that suggests the Jews are indeed Canaanites. But let's first talk about the different theories on what happened to the Canaanites. If you've read the Old Testament or the Torah, you'll know that the Jewish people came to the land and were instructed by God to destroy all Canaanites. The Canaanites no longer existed because the Jews took it over, and therefore Palestinians could never be Canaanites, or else they would have been destroyed. Much like the Philistine theory, it doesn't hold up to historical facts. However, if we put the Torah or the Old Testament aside and look at actual science, there are a number of theories that suggest what happened to the Canaanites. Destruction by the Israelites is definitely one of them, a claim held by some scholars. This is known as the conquest model. The peaceful infiltration model suggests that the Jews did come back from Egypt, much like the biblical story. However, rather than a big war and taking them all out, the Israelite people moved into the region and they cohabitated with the Canaanites, and eventually the Canaanites became the Israelites. They intermarried, and the Canaanites gave up their ways and joined the Israelites, yet again suggesting that the Canaanites are the Israelites or the Jews, not Palestinians. There is one more option that some scholars do suggest, and this is called either the Canaanite resettlement or the peasant revolt model. This suggests that the Israelites were in fact Canaanites at one point, and they were somewhat of a breakaway group from the rest of the Canaanites. This would suggest that these little groups of Canaanites decided to break away, call themselves the Israelites, follow a different god, and some even suggest that the story of Exodus from Egypt is actually a metaphor for this peasant revolt getting away from the Canaanite people. And then the subsequent war that happened between this group and the Canaanites did in fact happen. With this option, the Israelites are in fact the Canaanites. No matter how you look at it, the Palestinian Arabs have no connection to Canaanites. So why do they keep saying it? For one, because it's the only thing they have left at this point. But number two is likely because some DNA tests have shown that Palestinian Arabs have Canaanite DNA. What they won't tell you, though, is that the exact same people who are actually Jewish converts to Islam that call themselves Palestinian are also containing DNA that ties them to the Canaanites. So these claims that people are suggesting that DNA proves that Palestinians are connected to the Canaanites are missing a step. That is, that the Canaanites were Jews, that Jew converted to Islam and became a Palestinian. Doesn't make Palestinians directly connected to Canaanites, it makes Jews connected to Canaanites. But just like before, they cherry pick one or two people that will fit their narrative and just assume that you'll believe that every other Palestinian Arab, no matter where they came from, also fits that same theory. This theory was easily backed up by the fact that a study in 2020 established that the ancient Israelites were in fact descendants from Canaanites. The report, published in Cell magazine, took the bodies of people found in the area in the first century, mostly Jews, and they found DNA that tied them to the Canaanites. Ancient Israelites were directly related to Canaanites. And not surprisingly, so were people like the Phoenicians and other indigenous people around that area, not the Arabs. You can either be Canaanite or Arab. You can't be both. All of these theories that are being put out, suggesting that the Palestinian Arabs are all indigenous, goes against all historical records and all DNA tests that we've ever seen. And even more hilarious about this whole thing is the easiest thing that even the people themselves can see. How many Arab people today, calling themselves Palestinians, know exactly where they come from? Because their last name tells them so. The irony of a person who calls themselves today a Palestinian with the last name al-Masri, Masr meaning Egypt, so their last name says the Egyptian, while claiming to be Palestinian. Where do you think your name came from? Your family did come from Egypt, otherwise they wouldn't be called the Egyptian. There are other very popular names in Palestinian Arab areas, like al-Baghdadi, meaning the man from Baghdad, or the Iraqi. So again, you are a Palestinian Arab who was indigenous to the land, but for some reason, when you guys created last names, you said, I'm from a completely different country? Doesn't really make much sense to me. There are many more examples of this, like al-Yemeni, someone from Yemen, al-Saud, meaning you're from Saudi Arabia, al-Hijazi, al-Qureshi, al-Husseini. All of these are names from Saudi Arabia. So the irony when you're complaining to a DNA company that my DNA tells me I'm from Saudi Arabia, while my last name is al-Saud, seems to check out. And if after the last 15 to 20 minutes of this podcast didn't convince you, you think this isn't possible, there's no way that they force converted so many people, this is still happening today, all over Africa and even within Israel itself. One of the released hostages, who was in captivity for 700 plus days, Rom Braslavsky, has spoken about his time in Gaza. He explained that he was beaten and tortured every single day while being starved in captivity. And his captors would often try and give him extra food or the promise of extra food. All he had to do was convert to Islam. If you want an example of what life was like for a Jew living in the land of Israel or Judea during the Arab conquest, I think Rom probably got a little taste of what our ancestors went through. He was one of those strong, brave Jews who refused to give up on his faith, even when it could have given him food and better treatment. In the end, this podcast is supposed to show you that, yes, some Palestinian Arabs are in fact indigenous to the land. It is a vast minority of them, and they don't even realize the reason they're indigenous is because they are Jewish. However, people are trying to use this little connection that someone might have, their DNA saying they're actually a Canaanite or from Israel, because they are a converted Jew, and suggest that this represents the entire population, and that we should ignore the fact that their last name is the Egyptian, and that they don't come from the land of Palestine, a land that never really existed. They have desperately tried to pretend that the Arabization of the entire Middle East and North Africa didn't happen in Israel, that these people weren't force converted, either through taxation or threat of death. We really should look at both sides of the story here, which is the fact that there are some people who call themselves Palestinians that are indeed indigenous, because they're Jews. We can't ignore that reality. But we also can't let people pretend that that is somehow representative of everyone who today calls themselves Palestinians. Because remember, there were no such thing as Palestinians up until the 1960s. They made it up. They were all just Arabs and Arab converts. And as long as people on both sides of this argument pretend that the Arab colonization, the Arab forced conversion didn't take place, you're just ignoring history, and you'll never know what really happened in that land. But the fact that they're trying to manipulate and fake a history to suggest they were there first, or that they are the rightful owners, is just completely a lie, at least on a large scale. And no matter how much you attempt to suggest that you are the indigenous people and that you didn't conquer the land and then immigrate to it, you will really never come to terms with the fact that you are both colonizers and in some cases colonized. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.